If you're enjoying haunted UK fiction, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or Ko-fi. Simply search for Haunted UK Podcast. These marshes and bogs beheld a great abundance of streams which crisscrossed the rough grass in huge spiderweb formations. These streams grew, split, thickened and slowed so very gradually until, at the very heart of the marsh, all gentle trickling ceased, and great pools of brown waters stood silent and deep. I'd been informed that these areas were known as the mosses, and it would be most unwise to leave the path and explore them. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to Haunted UK Fiction, a sister podcast to the Haunted UK, which features original flash fiction, short stories, and novellas with paranormal themes. All stories you will hear were written by a collection of talented writers, authors, and storytellers, both independent and professional. In today's episode, we'll be reading Part 1 of The Mosses by L.D. Brown. L.D. Brown lives in the village of Hawkshead, Cumbria, with his wife and too many cats. They own a beer shop together. For the past 7 years, he's been running ghost walks in the village under the name Tallow Tales, the Hawkshead Ghost Walk. Twice weekly, he takes visitors around the village, regaling them with stories of local folklore. This also gives him the opportunity to wear a top hat. In his free time, he writes horror stories and has been fortunate enough to get a few published here and there. He's hoping to get a collection together soon. His fiction is influenced by the bleaker side of the Lake District landscape: rainy, dripping woodlands, mosses, tarns, wetlands, and their sinister ilk. His literary influences include Arthur Machen, M.R. James, E.F. Benson, J.H. Riddle, and Algernon Blackwood. He enjoys folk horror films and Peter Cushing. Get comfortable. Grab a little something to sip on. Perhaps cuddle up under a blanket to help offset the chills coming your way. And let's dive into the story. Certainly, I would call myself quite freely and without much hesitation a solitary man. A man who very much enjoys his own company and will take great pains to see it come to fruition. As I've grown older, I've found that outside company and social obligations have appeared to irk me increasingly by small, steady increments, until not only can I not muster the appropriate enthusiasm for the occasion, but I also cannot adequately parody the required sentiments either. To put it another way, I simply cannot fake a smile. I'm not the bar humbug type, I assure you. Recently, I've discovered that conversation bores me. Dinner parties depress me, and whenever I'm put into the situation of having to talk about oneself, I cannot help but feel that time would be better spent in my own home, accompanied by a book and a glass of something warming if the weather calls for it. My immediate family have grown accustomed to this solitary compulsion of mine and deem to meet with me infrequently, at dates of their choosing. For this, I'm eternally grateful. As such, I've found that the pursuit of hiking is one which, to me, is exceedingly agreeable. The simple act of walking is strangely meditative. I hold many a walking holiday under my belt and have successfully completed a great number of well-known trails, infamous routes, historic ways, and ancient paths. One such holiday took me to the extreme north of the country, almost on the very border itself, where I endeavoured to explore areas of a vast and ancient forest. Situated on the very edge of this wild expanse was a large market town of old-fashioned red brick buildings and wide squares. I booked myself into the George Hotel on Main Street, the only hotel it transpired, for several nights. My preliminary jaunt into that vast forest was not an exhaustive hike. It was merely a gentle stroll amongst numerous paths, so that I might get a feel for the lay of the land. Upon crowning the brows of small rises and admiring the views, it became clear that the forest consisted of countless patches of thick trees and carpets of moss, interspersed with pockets of large clearings, wide openings. These large spaces were, in fact, dismal areas of low marshland, from which sprouted tough weeds, wiry grass, and the odd fir tree, growing at a crooked angle and adding a peculiar comedic look to the surroundings. These marshes and bogs beheld a great abundance of streams which criss-crossed the rough grass in huge spiderweb formations. These streams grew, split, thickened, and slowed so very gradually until, at the very heart of the marsh, all gentle trickling ceased and great pools of brown water stood silent and deep. I'd been informed that these areas were known as the mosses, and it would be most unwise to leave the path and explore them. During the summer, however, these uniquely beautiful wetlands play host to an eclectic variety of wildlife, including a rare species of dragonfly, and are a popular destination for all sorts of enthusiasts, from botanists to insect fanciers. But these experts of their respective fields are required also to be expert navigators in order to traverse the intolerable troughs and dips of this place. I was visiting the forest during a particularly bleak November, and all around was grey and damp. Patches of mist clung tightly to the hollows, and small droplets of moisture sparkled on the tips of flowerless bladderwort. This terrain of heavy vegetation, dotted with treeless mosses, had the appearance of sporadic tufts of fur sprouting from a worn and much-loved teddy bear. Continuing my wanderings, I was conscious of being enveloped in a profound silence. Neither bird nor woodland creature stirred, and my boots, as they crunched the small pebbles and stones of the dirt track, resonated eerily crisp and clear. It was not, however, an unpleasant experience. The path ascended gently to a definite summit of sorts. To my immediate left stood an area of densely growing silver birches. The peeling strips of white bark looked like pieces of translucent flesh hanging limply from blackened fingers. To my right, Scotch pines rose straight as an arrow to meet low, slow-moving clouds. I took the opportunity to rest. I perched on a piece of rotten log and took some refreshment. I spied two distinct mosses, at no great distance, separated by a ridge of turf crowned with poplars. It held the appearance of one long solitary grave. These particular mosses held several pools of stagnant water of no inconsequential depth. The surface of the oily water was topped with an unsavoury-looking froth. I noticed movement among the rushes. 3 figures had emerged from the trees and were advancing methodically into the deepest part of the moss. They were young, 2 gentlemen and a lady. Beneath spotless knee-length goloshes, they were dressed smartly and in a somewhat dandyish fashion of brightly coloured tweeds and matching caps. Snatches of laughter and brazen chatter floated upwards to my solitary seat. The figures carried with them an abundance of cumbersome equipment, crates of glass jars, spades, and colanders. Presently, these 3 youths were knee-deep in peat and examining the undergrowth with sharp jabs of their walking sticks. It soon became apparent that they were collecting the mud from the mosses, using their spades and shovels to extract neat cubes of the earth from the water. They filtered it, firstly by draining the mud in the colanders, picking the stray pieces of weed and the odd stone from the dripping substance before depositing it carefully into the jars. One of the men produced a wine bottle from his knapsack, and between the bouts of bending and kneeling and draining, the bottle did its rounds, and all three would take a hearty swig at frequent individuals. A queer, unfamiliar feeling arose. I had a strong desire to talk to these individuals and ask them about their unusual pursuit. Was this a geographical study? Perhaps the trio were scientists testing the acidity of the soil. The collective bursts of laughter and good-natured raillery did not, as it usually would, irritate or annoy me. Rather, I was overwhelmed with a curious intoxication. So persistent was this intoxication, I soon left my moss-encrusted seat and advanced towards the joyful party with a hand outstretched in greeting. I was addressed initially by the gentleman in the lighter shade of green tweed. He straightened up from his arduous task and beamed, "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," I replied, still surprised at my own inclination to engage in conversation. "May I ask what it is you're doing?" The young lady now rose from her work and pushed back her cap so it rested delicately on the crown of her head. "Collecting mud, silly," she said with a boyish chuckle. Ordinarily, to be teased in such a way, even in such a tame and mild-mannered way as to be called silly, would have left me utterly humiliated and provoke within me a desire for flight. However, so sweetly was this word uttered, almost as if it were a term of endearment, and so obvious their task and so absurd my question, that an involuntary smile came to my lips, and the girl, thankfully, reciprocated. I'm rarely in the company of the opposite sex. She was what my mother would describe as not beautiful, but certainly pretty. The exertion of her work had brought perspiration to red, round cheeks. Her hair was cropped unconventionally short, but it suited her well, and her eyes, even though lovely and blue, possessed an odd, smudgy quality. It was precisely this strangeness that I found utterly compelling. By now I'd been introduced to the three and had shaken them all by the hand. They were university students from the south and were taking a well-deserved break. Here the two young men nudged each other, from their studious reflections to indulge in a collective hobby. "Geography," I ventured. "History," replied one of the gentlemen. James was his name. "Ancient history," added the other, Simon. One of the glass jars was thrust into my hand for my immediate inspection. It had been filled to the brim with mud. The substance was almost black and seemed to issue steam as if it were warm or reacting violently with the air. It possessed a strong, acrid odour, an odour of muskiness, of great age. "We experiment with history," he continued. "Our desire is to get to the very crux of certain beliefs. Whenever we are able, and whenever finances and holidays allow," he added with a grin, "we travel the wide expanse of our fair country and, wherever we might end up, we become acquainted with the local folklore of that particular region. Stories, legends, myths." "Any enticing tidbit," chimed in the girl. "Any enticing tidbit," Simon agreed. "We possess quite the appetite for any strange custom or tale of local witchcraft. Then, if we're fortunate enough to find the necessary materials, we'll use them to practice certain rites, I suppose. In a controlled environment, of course." I must have looked very stupid and remained silent for a fraction too long, for the girl, in an excited and breathless sort of way, made things a little clearer. Apparently, I was holding magic mud. Inwardly I scoffed, yet kept my composure, and with effort I held an attentive expression. The mosses at their treacherous centres contained pockets of this special substance, which was now held safely within that jar. I was told the following story. This trio of adventurers, on one of their many visits to the university library, in their favourite and much-frequented section, a smallish one, I was told, upstairs in a dimly lit corridor which contained many a crumbling tome on its dusty and forgotten shelves, they rejoiced to discover ancient passages detailing a myriad of magical uses for this most common of substances, Under what I assume must have been golden cloistered ceilings, the trio read on excitedly, and collectively they formed a plan to visit the north. A plan for a visit and an experiment. They were at that moment in the borderlands, not far from sections of Hadrian's Wall. The mud of the mosses had been known by various civilizations to possess certain properties. The Romans knew of its mysterious power, and soldiers had been told by their superiors to rub great quantities of the stuff into their swords. This would not merely strengthen their weapons, but would ensure that blows would prove catastrophic. The barest scratch would be fatal. The Celts didn't require the mud to improve their weapons, however. Only it was valued for its ability to accentuate, to exasperate their spirits. The mud was applied directly to the eyes to summon a hallucinogenic effect. In a fervour of extreme elation, they could work themselves up into some sort of ferocious frenzy, similar in temperament to the Viking berserkers. As the three sat reading by the soft glare of an oil lamp in that hidden section of the university library, or so I imagined, their fascination and wonder bloomed interminably. What was of particular interest to the young historians was the way in which the mud had been utilised for such vastly different results throughout the centuries. In more recent times, self-professed wise women of the 17th century, before the cruel sweep of witch-hunting mania would condemn them for their practices, would use the mud for a wide array of poultices and remedies. There also exists a peculiar theory, concluded the girl, her eyes ablaze, that the border reivers performed certain burial. "Which one of you swizzlers finished the wine?" demanded James in mock indignation. Another bottle was produced, and the three friends continued their work. Very kindly, they invited me to stay and watch their unusual excavation. I offered to assist, but as I possessed no goloshes and the group had none to spare, they bid me to recline upon the grassy ridge and keep them company. The three kept me involved within the conversation by calling over their shoulders gaily and reporting upon their progress. At times they even brought me the bottle of wine to where I sat and cajoled me to take a swig. Upon acquiescence, they would cheer loudly and, just once, the girl patted me roughly on the back and announced, "Well done," and produced a smile that was very sweet. Sweet, yet darkened by something thrilling. Within approximately half an hour, with stagnant water still up to their ankles and with smears of mud here and there, the results of a pondweed fight, the group had 10 jars filled with this seemingly precious bounty. They ascended from the ooze to join me on the ridge. They began to scrape the mud from their boots, and the girl sat close beside me, her knee grazing mine. "What exactly are you going to do with all those jars?" They informed me that, on that very evening, they would be applying the mud directly to their skin and recording, methodically and scientifically of course, any unusual effects that might be experienced. "You're more than welcome to join us," they said. As it transpired, the three youngsters were staying at the George, though through the necessity of frugality they were lodging in one singular room. I examined the glistening jars of oily mud. The contents had clean, neat edges where the spade had been used with great proficiency to extricate the common brown muck from that most coveted of substances. A vague unease rose within me. I declined their offer, but instead invited them to join me for a drink in the hotel bar after they had completed their experiments. They agreed, and with a certain amount of enthusiasm, I was relieved to note. Picking up their equipment with a flourish, they bade me farewell and walked down the path together. They had gone only a little way before I realised, with a pang of embarrassment, that I'd completely forgotten their names, for I was somewhat out of practice regarding formalities. I called after them. As I mentioned earlier, there was James and Simon, and what two very fine strapping lads they were. The girl's name was exotic and foreign. When I inquired as to its origin, she replied that it was the name of a Greek goddess. Peculiar, then, that I have since forgotten it. Even when the odd opportunity has transpired for me to scroll through a book of Greek mythology, I fail to find the name anywhere, nor find a similar one to jog the memory. I have, over the past several years, even examined volumes of Roman, Norse, and pagan mythologies on the chance that I had misheard the girl, all to no avail. I can't put an appropriate name to that boyish round face. I continued my walk for a long time after the departure of the three. The frequent mosses that I encountered captivated me with their bleak beauty, and I pushed onwards in order to cross paths with more and more of them. Eventually, after wandering idly through a patch of golden beech trees, it was time to turn back and return to that sleepy market town, with its comfortingly old-fashioned hotel, which promised a certain faded glamour. Dining alone is an activity that, in my younger days, I would partake in with visible embarrassment. I had the absurd idea that strangers were monitoring my habits. I became so self-conscious that my fork would clatter against the plate, and I would pass the entire meal without tasting anything due to the mechanical chewing I had adopted. These days, however, I relish the opportunity to dine alone, knowing that my fellow diners care not a jot to look in my direction. Therefore, I take a book, read to my heart's content, indulge in wine, and bathe in the knowledge that I have been somewhat lost in the crowd. That evening, as enjoyable and relaxing as those 4 courses were, I detected stirring deep within my stomach an uncharacteristic excitement to join my new friends for that drink in the bar. I was to meet them as arranged prior, at 9:30. Withdrawing from the dining room a little before 9 o'clock, I occupied my mind in the bedroom by jotting down a few thoughts in my commonplace book. At the appointed time, I changed my jacket, left the room, and descended the wide cantilever staircase in good spirits. My new friends weren't in the bar. I was punctual, but by no means early. I experienced the first bitter pangs of disappointment. Leaning on the bar, I ordered a drink, but by the time it had been consumed, I had reasoned that the 3 were simply not coming. A brief wave of humiliation, of anger too, but I overcame this rather promptly by reasoning to myself, they're young and had already partaken in a little wine. Perhaps they'd forgotten the engagement. Perhaps they'd taken a nap that evolved into a deep sleep. Maybe, just maybe, they were a little lost in returning from some secluded restaurant. There were countless reasons as to their absence. There was no need to indulge the fancy that their actions were in the least bit spiteful. Besides, it was distinctly possible that I would encounter them all at some point in the following days. Having consoled myself admirably, my spirits were regained. Not wanting to retire to bed quite yet, I took a stroll through the streets of the quiet town with the intention of stopping somewhere for a nightcap. It was a mild evening, and a little mist had descended, softening the lamplight and allowing little halos of gold to blossom. My footsteps, as in the forest, echoed satisfyingly through the deserted lanes. I filled my lungs with cool, crisp air. I spotted a side street that appeared to lead to some quaint square or other. It was gloomy and narrow, but promised to widen after several yards. I was correct in my assumptions. Opposite a small Georgian crescent of antique shops and booksellers ran tall cast-iron railings. Beyond these, rising from the mist, was a large church of red sandstone. It was built in the neoclassical style, an imposing build that was surrounded by an extensive churchyard which, in the haze, appeared unreal, phantasmagoric. Both gardens and structure had a feeling of artifice, of being part of some elaborate theatre set. The monuments and gravestones may as well have been constructed from cardboard, so flat and inconsequential did they appear against the damp vapour. I began a slow circuit of the church, but halted quite suddenly at nearly halfway around. There, between the railings and the church, lying beneath the prodigious yew tree, were 2 figures, their pale flesh phosphorant in the shrouded moonlight. They were embracing. Undetected, I began to creep back towards the main street, but then I saw, not without a little shock, that the figures were Simon and the girl. Creeping closer, I peered through the railings. 2 pairs of wide eyes, shining, bright, yet completely unseeing. I had the distinct impression that the pair were witnessing something remarkable, something perhaps divine. Certainly it was something that made their faces radiate exultantly, but something nonetheless ethereal. Their mouths were agape with sheer wonder. Periodically, the pair would lift their hands very slowly and pluck at the thin air as if trying to catch butterflies or strum invisible musical strings. The girl began to sing sweet nonsensical words, and Simon began to moan deep guttural sounds that I had never before heard any living person utter. Their foreheads were marked with a little mud, a distinct streak of black. I had to turn away. I had to leave that place. I strode back towards the George, pondering upon what I'd just witnessed. I had trespassed on a profoundly sacred experience. I believed that, sincerely. An unknown, an eldritch power that was at play. The stone flags were monumentally illuminated by a shaft of warm yellow light. The door to a public house had been thrown open and the interior glow had spilled across the pavement. On the threshold, teetering a little from side to side, was a man, evidently very drunk. In horror, I saw him lurch forward, blocking my path. He spinned on his heels. It was James. His eyes were wild, rolling and rolling around in such wide, unblinking sockets that the whites were clearly visible. The pupils were mere pinpricks. They stood out livid and bright against the caked muck that had been smeared onto his eyelids and which had been allowed to dry to a crust. He was not drunk, but in the depth of some hideous rage. His moustache, immaculate when I had first seen it, was now specked with spittle and dust. I cannot say even now if he noticed or recognized me, for all of a sudden he sprinted awkwardly down the empty street with his arms tight by his sides and his fists clenched, marionette-like. Those heavy arms appeared unmoving, but for a weird vibration, as if manipulated by electricity. Another figure appeared to take James's place, a great bearded man clutching a bloodied handkerchief to his nose. I was able to fire a quick glance over his substantial shoulder and witnessed a dismal scene within the pub. A table had been overturned. Shards of glittering glass lay trodden between the floor tiles, and several people were giving a great deal of attention to another prodigious individual who was slumped in a chair, quaffing great quantities of brandy while a large blow to the head was being stemmed. The gentleman with the red nose, the landlord, for he wore a beer-soaked apron, glared with malice at the retreating figure of James. Spotting me standing there, he kept my gaze, rolled his eyes and shrugged as if to express a mixture of sheer bewilderment, displeasure, and the old adage, just another day. I smiled apologetically and continued my way to the George. I didn't quite know what to think of the events of that night. They had left me curiously cold and unnerved. I had one final drink at the hotel bar and meditated upon the scenes witnessed. Strangely, I wasn't frightened at the prospect of meeting the trio later that evening, even though it was perfectly reasonable for them to appear through the lobby entrance at any moment, in whatever dreadful state they might be. The thought simply did not occur to me at the time. Rather, I was ruminating upon the mud from the mosses. Eventually, James, Simon, and the girl had truly experienced the potent powers that the substance was rumoured to possess. Like a drug, however, the effects differed widely depending upon the individual. In some cases, the effects were catastrophic. I was reminded of my own university days, in particular those frequent occasions when libations were taken. It was curious to witness the varying temperaments of my colleagues after an extensive period of drinking. Depending on the venue, the wine consumed was usually of the same quality, and there was a certain consistency in the volume drunk, all of us ensuring that we kept pace with one another, and yet the grape would enliven the spirits of some and dampen those of others. So was the case with the mud. I've since come to realize that this is where the analogy ends, for there was something about the mud that was extremely dangerous. The clock in the square struck the 3/4, 11:15, and I decided to retire for the evening. Ascending the stairs, I anticipated a hypothetical meeting with my new friends in the morning. I decided to keep my evening jaunt to myself and feign ignorance of any stories that they might wish to recount. My sleep that night was troubled. I experienced curious dreams. Strange dreams. They were frightening, certainly, yet oddly compelling. So compelling that when I woke with a start from one such episode, I would clench my eyes shut and hope that a similar dream or conclusion may be forthcoming. On awakening once again, this eager hope was replaced with great impatience and longing. No matter what odd memory or unreal scenario might greet me in slumber, the ending of the scene would always remain the same. Trees. Trees, tall, ancient, and fearsome. Trees would rise before me and then part swiftly, as if they were merely painted on a curtain. With a great swish of my hands, huge in the moonlight, the curtain would part. In a clearing of moss encircled by many birches, I saw flesh. There were a great many people, quite simply too many to count, and it was impossible to decipher where one person began and one ended. I couldn't step back to gain a better view, as the trees behind seemed to push me gently onwards. A haze of suffocating warmth and sweet odours enveloped me, and I descended to the soft ground, exploring with hands and lips. I saw a perfect handprint of mud on round, supple skin. A face was lifted. A pair of smoky, smudgy eyes met mine. That brings us to the end of this episode. Part 2 of The Mosses will be released shortly, so stay tuned. We truly hope you enjoyed this eerie tale. If you'd like to hear more from L.D. Brown, you can find his story The Overcoat in Season 1 of Haunted UK Fiction. He's also hoping to get a collection of his short fiction published in the near future and has written a short horror novella which he has been sending to publishers. L.D. Brown's social media and contact information can be found in the show's notes. If you have an original story that would send a chill down our spines and you would like to submit it for review, simply send it in to hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. That's hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. Until the next time, stay safe and take care.